Hey guys, this is Caleb with White Metal Games, and this is War Council, a miniature hobby podcast dedicated to miniature painting and all things related. My name is Caleb Dillon.
And I'm Phil Corman with Brushwork Minis.
And this is our brand new format of the show, episode 12 on object source lighting. The first 10 episodes of the show were under an old format, and now we've changed it up. We're mixing it up, and we're trying something a little bit different. Philip, what is new with you this week? What's going on with you?
Not much. Enjoying the beautiful weather. It's been quite nice, especially today. A little overcast, but very cool.
Big storms rolling in.
Yeah, apparently. There was a big storm a couple days ago as well, but yeah, it's been nice so far. Trying to think, there's been a few things coming up that are things that happened, but I'm drawing a blank on them right now. How about you?
I kind of feel like, and this is something that I posted this article on Bell maybe a month or two ago about the pros, the cons of pro painting is what I called it. And in it, I was just sort of trying to point out some of the interesting points about working at home as a miniature painter. I transitioned full-time to miniature painting back in January, and it's been pretty good, but like any sort of independent venture, I read somewhere that you work 80 hours to avoid working 40, which I agree with. It's a busy job.
Yeah.
But one of the things that it's allowed me to do is just have more time at home. So I find myself, and my wife probably would not agree with this, but I find myself doing more of the home duties, like, you know, emptying dishwashers and that sort of thing, mowing the grass and blah, blah, blah. Stuff that I should have been doing before, but I kind of was putting off because I had a full-time job. But now, because I'm at home more, I've had a couple of contractors in the last couple of months. We've been doing some stuff around the house. We've been having our libraries, we like to call it. We're having a new door mounted. And it feels like my house is kind of a revolving door where we have people coming in and out all the time. I have contractors in and out all the time. And it actually kind of cuts into your workflow. I never appreciated going away till the office till this started happening. And I actually thought it was kind of ironic that I started working at home to sort of have some peace and try to get away and get more stuff accomplished. But when people come in at all different hours, some of them don't even knock anymore. They just walk in because I gave them a key. And God forbid I be, I don't know, getting out of the shower or something. Okay, we're going to move on to On the Painting Desk. This is previously on the show. On the old show, we used to call this Sit Rep for so many of our old subscribers. This is a segment of the show where we talk about what we're currently working on. Philip, what are you working on at the moment?
So currently on my desk, I've got some of the new characters for Stormcast. So
Yeah.
Lord Silicon on foot, the archers. I can't remember all their names, but I've got a couple of those guys working on, and also an Imperial Knight. So
I haven't even looked at the rules for the I think they're called Judicators. Are they? Have you looked at the rules at all for them? Are they better with the regular bow versus like the giant?
Yeah, so the standard bow has longer range. I think it's double the range, and it has rapid fire, I believe. The crossbow does as well, but I think it's at least 8 inches less.
Nice. And
less shots. So I don't really understand why you take the crossbow. There's like a heavy crossbow that shoots some crazy amount of attacks.
I saw that.
But other than that, I think from what I can tell, it looks like the long range is beneficial in every manner. So
now that points are kind of out the window, I have a client on my painting desk right now. I've got Wood Elves for a client, and on the entry, it's like for Eternal Guard or Glade Guard or something. On the entry, it says, you know, one or more guys can be banner bearers, one or more guys can be musicians. And because there's no point allowance to it anymore, and that doesn't change their weapons, it occurred to me, I was like, why wouldn't you just do 2 or 3 of each in the unit? You know, and most of the time the kit doesn't allow it, but in this particular kit, it's like Glade Guard. They have like 4 banners and like 4 musical instruments, and so it's because they redid the sprue. Just when they reprinted it, they just reprinted it every time, so you get like 4 of them in the kit. So it occurred to me, why not just take a bunch of those guys, even though it looks a little silly in terms of like a competitive nature. It might be helpful to your game, because then if your musician dies, well, that's okay, you got 3 more.
Yeah.
And I think the newer kits don't really do that as much. They're more efficient in terms of their space. They only have like 1 of each option. But we, you know, sort of on the same point, like you said, now that there's no points allowed, you can just why wouldn't you take the better weapon when there's an option allowed for that? What else are you working on paint wise?
So I'm actually working on some custom bases. So last week or 2 weeks ago, last session, we mentioned, or I spoke about the Joan of Arc model that I was working on from Affinity. And I felt that she deserved a special base. So I'm currently making one out of scratch. It's actually built, most of it's painted, and I just got to do the final touches on that, and that'll be done.
When you build your custom bases, when you say build from scratch, what do you mean exactly?
So with this one in particular, I'm using Plasticard.
Okay.
So I've got varying levels of thin cutout and kind of a sci-fi pattern. I put in extra bits from different things that I had, but it's very clean. Trying to make it more futuristic, and hopefully that'll be up on my.
So are you kind of putting her like when you say with? I guess what I'm trying to get at is are you making her elevated? Or are you trying to like is she standing on like a pile of Plasticard boxes, or is it more like she's standing on some scrap that's made out of Plasticard, or like, give me a visual like what's
it's
that?
more like she's maybe standing on the side of a road or something.
Okay.
But it's sci-fi, so it's not your pavement asphalt. Everything's clean.
Sure.
Looks very futuristic, I guess.
Yeah,
There's sort red lighting and things on the sides to bring out edges and things to make it pop even more.
When you say red lighting, do you mean like an object source lighting effect?
Something like that, yeah.
Nice. Well, that's great because that's our main topic today. So,
Mm-hmm.
for me, currently, aside from the wood elves, I finished up the centaurs for one of my previous clients. Those are all done, and that was a fun little project because he's a long-term client that's been working with me in the past, and he's kind of special in that he has a stipend. Every month he pays me a flat fee, and then I paint until I reach that level of the fee being done. So it's one of those wonderful examples of a client painter relationship where he has generally a little less money than my average clients, but he worked it out with me. He's been a client of mine for years now, so he worked it out with me that I get a consistent stipend from him so I can paint consistently for him and a little bit lower. And that's on the new site when we relaunch White Metal Games 2.0, one of the options I'm going to put in there for pricing is something like negotiating. So you kind of come to us with your budget, and we sort of, because my notion was that I don't ever want to leave a client behind. Like I always want to sort of work with them on their budget, and if I can make it work in their budget, there might be a way to do it. And a lot of clients like have, they have their own budget in mind, and then it becomes a question of can they sacrifice their level? Can they sacrifice the quality for what they're hoping to achieve? I had a situation recently with a client where he went to the White Metal Games homepage, and on the old site, we used to have rates that were basically it was the retail cost of the model. So a box of Marines for $40, we would paint and assemble for $40. And I think a lot of painters do that when they first get started because they don't really know how to price out. And we quickly learned that this pricing model fell apart within a year or two. Reaper released this line called Bones, and they were super dirt cheap. So when the model's down to $2 or $3, painting it is absurd. You can't do it for $2 or $3 with any level of detail. And even at like higher levels, when we were like triple the retail price, it was still like 10, which was absurd. It's just too low. My mistake was on the painting page, we put a disclaimer saying these rates are no longer valid, but we didn't put it on the homepage. So this client contacted me, or a potential client. Pretty sure he's not going to buy from me. He contacted me, and when I quoted him what was going to be our new rate, and I explained to him he wanted a character figure, and I quoted him something like $40 for the level of detail he wanted, and which is very commiserate with the industry. He was incredibly disappointed because he was hoping for something more like 10. And even though we negotiated back and forth, and I tried to work with him on budget, and I tried to come down, and eventually I reduced it to something like $25, just to sort of be like, you know what, I'm sorry, I really want this to work. This is the lower than I ever do for character figures. I'll do 25 a piece. And he just didn't respond. And so it was one of those things that, I don't know, working with budget on clients is one of those areas that I wanted to work on. I wanted to not lose clients to other painters based on their budget, because my instinct is they're going to be spending their money somewhere. So why not spend it with me if I can sort of figure out what is their bottom line? Does that make sense? How do you go about on Brushwork Minis? How do you go about pricing?
It is something, as you mentioned earlier, it's that trying to figure out how to break that down. Originally, I had charged, it was like double the price of the box set. But
that would have been a better idea for me, I think, from the get-go.
But again, it still falls apart when you get models where you've got like boxes of orcs that come with 20 miniatures, whereas Space Marines only come with 10, or a box comes with 5.
Right.
So it doesn't work on a large scale, and it does fall apart. So I do have to come more to an idea of what they're looking for, and generally have a price based on size of the model, how many you have,
sure,
level of paint job.
Sure.
It's the only way you can really get a good idea or a good estimate of what the value of that model is going to be.
And this is something that when you first came here a few weeks, or well, I guess a month ago now, but we were sitting down and I was in the process of revising the rates for the new site, and we talked a lot about like you helped me kind of, it was nice to have another painter to bounce ideas off of in terms of painting. And while I don't want to make this a whole show, because I think we could do a show about client relationships and that sort of thing, and I think we should. I completely lost my train of thought. But I think the point I was getting at is that I've had trouble sort of educating clients as to what is a fair price.
Mm-hmm.
Clients have some clients don't fully understand like what is a good price for this, because when you think about like if I go out to Target and buy a t-shirt, I generally know like this is what a t-shirt costs at Target versus Walmart. But with the painting industry, it's really up in the air. Mm-hmm. Like I've been looking at, I've always looked at different people's sites to see how they price, and everyone does it differently. Some people do it the retail way, double retail, triple retail. Some people do it per figure. Some people start at like $1,000 minimum. Some people start at $1,000 a figure. It really just depends. And so there's no standardization in the industry. Because of that, I think that finding the right client and matching it with their budget is hard. So that's something that I've struggled with over the years, and we'll definitely delve into that more in the near future. The only other thing I have currently on my desk is I have a Tau client, and this kind of dovetails into the news and rumors section, so I'll use this as sort of a way to kind of dip into that, is that I have a Tau client that we're doing a Tau army in red, but it's not a Farseer army. Farsight. Farseer, that's an elder, I think. So it's not a Farsight army. It's a little bit different. Like we're doing the missiles in white, but it's red and black, I think, or instead of like red and gray. So that's going to be a really fun project. And that was another instance where the client had we had kind of worked it out, where he wanted something that was a little kind of fast. We had to come to an agreement in terms of getting it out there fast. Not in terms of speed, but in terms of just not dedicating a lot of time to it. And for some painters, they have a hard time, I wouldn't say lowering their bar, but lowering their level. Like just in terms of like, I heard this statement one time about what do you paint towards? Is it for a tabletop? Is it for display? So in this instance, these guys just wanted something for the table. They wanted something quick and easy. And so that'll be coming together hopefully in the near future, and we'll get that up and you guys can take a look.
Cool.
All right, so we're going to go ahead and move on to news and rumors, because there's a ton of news and rumors out right now, and I'm very excited about it. Philip, what are you most excited about on the rumor train right now?
Well, there's a couple of things. The Tau, as you mentioned earlier, that is supposed to be coming out, I believe, September 12th or the 19th. There's supposed to be a big announcement for that, and they're saying there's going to be a couple new suit kits, a new commander, all plastic. So I love Tau. That was one of the first armies I started with when I was playing about 15 years ago. So very cool, very exciting.
Did you have you ever worked with the resin commander?
Yes, I have. I had him. I gave him away.
Yeah.
He was.
What are your thoughts on that kit?
I mean, that's just what is it? A fine cast in general.
Not the fine cast aspect. I mean, the fine cast is sort of one thing. We could have a whole podcast about that. But did you like the kit in general, or did you find it frustrating?
It is frustrating. It easily breaks.
Yeah.
And there's a lot. It looks really cool.
Yeah,
a lot of flowing
dynamic.
parts. Very dynamic. Yes. Because it is in the fine cast, it wasn't the most smooth in some areas, and there were some issues with the mold itself.
Sure.
But
my issue with it is the dynamic aspect is great, but he tends to tip.
Yeah.
So you have to weight him a little bit, and
transporting him is impossible. He's got those like flowing ribbons coming off that are just holding on by like a millimeter of area.
I agree.
bad.
That's one of the things I've noticed with the better GW gets in terms of like releasing models, or not even just GW, but anybody, they can make the pieces smaller and smaller. Like I recently put together a Durthu for the Wood Elves, and he has this whip that's super thin, but it's so thin that when you actually clip it off the sprue, if you clip it the wrong way, it'll break.
Yeah.
And that happens with a lot of things, and I don't think the designers think about that too much. Like I wish they made things just a little thicker to prevent that versus the thinnest they can make it, because what tends to happen is it'll break, it'll chip, and then it's like when you go to, like, people don't think about this, but when you scrape mold lines, you have to really be careful, because a lot of times when you scrape a mold line, if it's on a piece that's too thin, it's very easy to break it, and then the smaller the piece, the harder it is to glue and that sort of thing. Okay, so Tau, lots of Tau rumors. Have you seen the new giant picture for the kit from Forge World? They have a new giant.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he's looking
supposed
good.
to be like the Titan version of the Tau.
I don't think it's supposed to be like Warhound size. I think it's supposed to be more like a knight version or something a little bit like, it's not a knight version, but more like the giant knights. I don't really know what to call it.
The Celeste. No, I can't.
Something
remember.
like that.
Yeah.
But the ones that are like crazy tall, like the tall boy knights. So I think it's supposed to be about in par with that size, but he's just bristling with weaponry. He looks really good.
It does.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that one. Let's see what else. 30K, Age of Heresy. Is that what it's called? Age of Heresy? Or the Heresy?
Horus Heresy.
Horus Heresy,
yeah.
I'm thinking, I'm combining Age of Sigmar. Are you a Horus Heresy enthusiast?
Not really. I didn't follow it too much. I like the story behind it and stuff, but the models, I never really got into that much.
Sure.
Most of them just seemed like different variations of Space Marines.
Older Mark armors.
Yeah. The characters, though, have always been pretty cool.
Yeah.
So
I see a lot of great conversions out there for 30K. A lot of people have done like the Emperor and the Emperor's Guard and stuff. But it's hard to sort of do the Chaos side of that. And when I think about 30K, I almost always think about the Emperor and all of his guards, because that's what they generally push. You don't really see too many pictures of like the old Chaos armor or that sort of thing. So I think that's, if I was excited about anything, that's what I'm sort of most excited about. Not because it's not useful to have 30K figures that don't have to be converted, but just to have Chaosy figures that are from that era that you don't have to convert.
Very true.
Because no one ever converts those for that era, or that I've seen. And I have no idea how other figures would look in 30K. Like, I don't know what orcs were like back then. I don't know. Probably not changed at all.
Orcs are probably much the same.
But it would be kind of fun if when they release 30K-ish stuff, that if they did like a take back to sort of the older things. Like when Forge World did, when they re-released sort of pre-Heresy era Space Marines, they made them look like the older kits. So I wish that would be kind of neat if they did that for like orcs, where they made it look like 2nd edition kits, but in the size of 4th edition or 5th edition models. All right, what else is out there? Let's see. There's a new Chaos Fort coming out for Age of Sigmar, and battle tiles to go along with it. So lots of new terrain coming out there. The fort is incredible. My first thought as soon as I saw that was I wanted to build another Skull Tower, which is a Baneblade variant for Chaos for the Khorne Lords. For the Khorne Lords, I don't know what I'm thinking. For the I guess just Khorne. Have you ever seen that? It's like basically it's a Baneblade sized tank with a giant tower of skulls kind of off the top, and it's got a couple guns. No. It's kind of a fun older kit. It was never a kit. It's always a scratch build, but it was an epic model. And then people started doing it in 40K. I did one about a year ago, and it was a lot of fun.
Cool.
See what else? Crix for Privateer Press. They have a new, I think it was called The Reckoning, but I'm not entirely for sure. But it has 3 new Jacks coming out, and then Denegra on the Soul Weaver, which is like this giant worm dragon kind of thing.
Like undead type thing.
Yeah. Scale wise, I think that's about on par with like one of the bigger gargantuan or colossals.
I think it is. Them. Yeah. Is it a colossal or is it a
I don't think it's a true colossal. I think it's the one step down from that.
Okay.
I don't know what they call the step down from that, like war engines or war wagons or something like that. So I think it's about that size. But we just did some Crix a few weeks ago, so I would love if that client recommissioned us to do that. That would be incredible.
Definitely.
We would love to play with that. You mentioned you're working on Celestant. We're really anticipating that Fleshhounds that have not
Someday.
reared their head. And you mentioned very specifically earlier, like the towel on this date. Do you ever find it frustrating when you hear a rumor that says like this date and then the rumor doesn't prove true? Because how many times have we heard flesh hounds like they'll be out August 8th or they'll be out this or they'll be out that? And now I don't even know where the rumor came from. Like I don't remember if it was on a...
Yeah, it's been a while.
Yeah.
I don't even know if they're coming out. Like, because I'd be surprised if they release Tau and then don't finish what they've already started with the corn and everything. So I don't know, but I am excited for the new Lord Celestin, the bigger model that's coming out. That's already been photographed. They've got image leaks on that too, so it looks cool. It's supposed to be the size of Nagasha here.
Yeah.
Maybe not bulk wise, but at least it's tall. So he's kind of flying up with huge wings.
Yeah.
Looks very cool.
I think that looks great. It kind of reminds me of the Saint Celestine from the Sisters of Battle. Did you ever see that figure?
Yeah.
It's kind of like this angelic.
Exactly.
Kind of, I feel like someone scratch built one of the new figure. I saw one on Worsier or something where they had taken 3 prosecutors and put all their wings together and made kind of a poor man's Celestant.
Interesting.
Which seems a little pushy because they don't even have rules yet. So it's like you're just kind of, I don't really know. But it looks beautiful figure.
Could be cool too. That now I'm thinking about it as a scratch build model, maybe for Sanguinius or Primarch of the Blood Angels.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about that. Well, yeah. So traditionally, I think it is Sanguinus.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a scratch build Sanguinus for a while, but I feel like normally they'll do his wings like on fire. But I could totally see it doing more angelic. Because the way they do the wings for the prosecutor, it kind of looks like, I guess it's supposed to be beams of light maybe coming out.
Yeah, I think Sanguinius is supposed to have actual wings. These are more like, like you're saying, like beams of light or some more steampunk type look to it.
They're cool. Like, I like it a lot, but I don't entirely understand it.
Yeah.
But it does look really neat. On the ones you did, you kind of painted them almost like sort of a white bluish pearl, so it almost looks kind of like feathers or like opalescent pearl. It looks really nice. Okay, so that's about it for news and rumors. So we're going to move on. Oh, you know what? Actually, we have a commercial break first. So we'll be right back after this brief break. Hey guys, it's Caleb with War Council. Are you a purveyor of stuff? Are you an entrepreneur with something to preneur? Do you sell things related to tabletop gaming, painting, or some other aspect of the miniatures hobby? Would you like to advertise to like at least 3 listeners a show? Then you've come to the right place. War Council has an unlimited number of sponsorship slots available. Each slot guarantees you a banner ad on the White Metal Games website, and we're like 300 likes on Facebook right now, so clearly at least 300 people could be bothered to click the like button at some point in time in their lives. For $20 a month, we'll promote you and your products on the show. For $10 more, you can have an entire 30-second commercial, like this one, only, better and more relevant and stuff. Email us at info@whitemetalgames.com for more information, and until you do, put your minis where your mouth is. Alright guys, and we're back. We are now going to move on to tips on technique, and this is the heart of the show. This is sort of our main topic of every new show in the new format. This week we're going to be tackling object source lighting, or OSL, as it's more commonly referred. So just as a brief overview, how would you describe OSL, Philip?
Well, typically the object source lighting is referring to a specific object on the model that's providing the light. So an example of this, or an easy example, would just be maybe a light on a tank.
Like a searchlight.
Searchlight, yeah. So that's providing the main source of light. Generally, you've got your brightest areas, your focal attention's coming towards that light, and then there's usually some stark shadow or some good contrast to bring your attention to that. And you want to, typically, you have a couple areas like that when you do heavy OSL on a miniature. But
I feel like this technique, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a diorama back when they were doing Golden Demons. There was a diorama about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago. And it's this, like a vampire keep, and it's like a knight or something walking up a set of stairs, and he's holding like a candle or a lamp or something. And it's reflecting on the wall, and it was kind of the first time I feel like OSL had ever become mainstream in painting, where it was sort of like, here is a new way of doing it, embrace it. And not that it didn't exist before that, but that was the first time I feel like the mainstream really caught wind of it. And then after that, you started to see people attempting it all over the place and doing different versions of it and that sort of stuff. I was trying to sort of trace back the origins of it before that, and I came across this term called chiaroscuro. I think I'm pronouncing that right. Let me see chiaroscuro, which is basically like a painting technique that they used to use, like Renaissance painters would use.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea was that you would sort of pinpoint the points of light and dark in a painting. A good example of this might be where you have a candle in the painting, and the candle is giving off the source of light. So you intentionally darken down certain areas of the painting to make the lighter areas pop. Do you find that when you do OSL, you intentionally do that, or do you just kind of oversaturate the light areas with light versus like intentionally darkening down your model?
It depends on what you're trying to convey. Like, I think for a really high level of painting, if you're trying to get like, you know, showcase level work, you'll darken everything around it.
Sure.
To show realistic shadows and darkening areas. If you're just doing something for tabletop, I would just usually saturation, just highly saturate a certain area with that color, slowly building that color up to the brighter point where that light's coming from.
And we can distinguish OSL from zenithal highlighting in that zenithal highlighting, normally the presumption is that the light is coming from somewhere off the model, like let's say the sun. Is the most common source, or moonlight. Like sometimes when I do like a graveyard, I'll do like a moonlight, and because it's not on the diorama, it's presumed off the model, and therefore it's zenithal, even if it's from the corner. So with OSL, generally speaking, I would say all the time that this would be the primary difference, is that the point is an object or a point on the model, whether it be a candle or a lamp or whatever. So when we were sort of talking about this, we were kind of going over what are the different ways people approach OSL, like how do you achieve it. So what I wanted to do was sort of just kind of go through different ways to do it. So the first way I think I've ever seen before any sort of other technique was just simply probably just dry brushing. Really, it was sort of the original OSL, like on that diorama where they just took thin layers of color and just sort of dusted it across a surface. So for example, if someone had like a lamp, and the lamp they sort of envisioned it was going to give off red and orange and yellow light, then they would dust red, yellow, and like, whatever, orange or red on the surface of like a wall or an adjacent surface and that sort of thing. Have you ever used dry brushing for that, or for OSL?
Not for OSL, no. And the problem is, as you mentioned, it gives a dusty effect, and it really doesn't lend itself, I think, to OSL. Yeah. OSL should be much more smooth, which I would say brings us to the next type of way to paint it, is doing like wet blending.
Sure.
Or glazing.
Sure. So why don't we distinguish what is wet blending versus what is glazing? Because I think that we were talking about this earlier, is that there's muddy water when it comes to what is wet blending, what is glazing, what is tinting, what is washing. So I thought we would sort of take this opportunity to give our definitions of what these things are. So when you say with a wet blend, how do you define wet blending?
So wet blending is, as I've always seen it and I understood, was you are blending various colors on the model itself while the paint is still wet.
Usually using some sort of drying retarder.
Possibly, yeah. Or, I usually just do it with just regular water. Really? I don't actually add any retard or anything. I
just find with acrylic-based paints, they dry really fast.
Yeah.
So not only on the brush, but also on the palette. Now, you use a wet palette, though, a lot of times.
I do, yeah.
So that's probably one of the primary differences there.
Me.
So, okay, so you just... And this is one of those things where with wet blending, people... a lot of times what I'll see is the two-brush technique, where they'll have two brushes, and they'll apply one color with one brush, they'll apply one color with the other brush, and then they'll kind of blend. So it's basically like mixing the color on the model.
As opposed to on the palette.
Right, yeah absolutely. So that's definitely one way. Another way I've seen is glazing, which for me, kind of the general idea of glazing is multiple thin washes which rest on the surface of the model. Yep. Is kind of the way I was always taught to sort of define that. That's opposed to, let's say, a wash, where the general idea is for it to sink down into the crevices, and also most of the time to darken. The general idea is to darken, whereas a glaze is meant to accentuate a color. For example, a yellow glaze, like Lementer's yellow is a good example of this. It's a way to sort of pull out a little extra pop of yellow. Like on the Crix models, you did them, and then we were like, how do we get a little more pop out of that? So we added a yellow glaze, and that worked out really well with the highlights because then it sort of brought the green up to a yellow center, which looked really nice.
Mm-hmm.
And that one extra little step really helped it to pop. Do you differentiate glazing from, let's say, tinting? Or some people call it candy tinting or candy.
Yeah.
Like, this is where it gets kind of muddy.
Yeah, and I feel like a tint is just a simpler glaze. So usually if you want to tint something, in my opinion, you're just adding one layer of that color.
Sure.
Very thin, and just to give it a little bit of, color to, like, say, a gray, or it's like your sword or something. If you want to give it a little bit of a bluish tint, over a gray steel, you can do just a little blue on there, and that will kind of bring it together.
I think it's important to realize that with, and I haven't really talked about this before, but my notion with painting is that you're sort of, and this gets into more applied technique, but as you thin out paints, the pigment gets more evenly applied, and the gradation between one color to the next gets thinner, so it becomes a much smoother transition.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where the tints kind of shine, is that you kind of just thin them out enough that you're just picking up some of the pigment. So you're getting that sort of hint of color.
Right.
So the only thing I would use to differentiate there is that there's a technique that they use in airbrushing a lot called candy, or candy is a type of paint, and this is where it gets a little muddy, but candy paints, or candy tints as they sometimes call them, the idea is that it's a color that's very, very thin down like a glaze, but normally it only works over white, is the general notion, is that you can apply it over a dark surface, but you're not really going to get much. So what they normally do is they'll say, like, use this over white. So what I found works really well, and I'm going to use Minotaur as an example here. They have this beautiful color called plasma fluid, which is just this sort of light bluish color that is obviously meant to emulate, like, plasma guns in the GW line, but it also works for lots of other stuff. Generally what you do is you'll highlight up to a white epicenter, like a radiant center, and you'll do just a dash of white to make your primary center, and then you just take a little bit of your candy glaze or your candy tint, and you just basically spray it right over that white, and what happens is the white absorbs a little bit of the color, so it gets basically a very bright white bluish color. Mm-hmm. And then because the tint is resting over darker colors, which don't make it show up as well, you get a natural blend. So it sort of blends out over color. So the effect is a really easy OSL.
Yeah.
With the exception of the fact that the epicenter is always white, which you may not always want in OSL, because maybe the generally I like a nice white radiant center, because I think as a society have decided everything's white at the center, whether it be heat or whether it be a laser gun or a lightsaber, it's always like a tint of white. So those are some of the different ways to make it work. What is your favorite, or the most your favorite way to sort of to do that? Like when you do OSL, how do you normally do it?
For me, it really depends on the size of the miniature. So if it's a smaller miniature, then I definitely prefer to do glazing.
Sure.
You have more control over it, and it has less chance of it getting sloppy. Airbrushing is great for larger miniatures, but you just can't do it on a small scale. So.
And what about, because I know that a lot of people who probably are not airbrush users and who are just more airbrush, I wouldn't say wannabe is the wrong word, but people who don't really have practical experience with it, mm-hmm. I've heard, and some people believe, like, you can use an airbrush to do anything if the needle's small enough, like you could even dot an eye with it. And the smallest needle I've ever used is a 0.3, mm-hmm. which is, as far as I know, one of the finest needles there is. I don't know if there's even one smaller than that. There might be. If there is, it's a very specialty airbrush. But, and one of the things that comes in with airbrushing a lot is hand-eye coordination. Have you ever tried to dot an eye with an airbrush? Like, have you?
I don't know who's ever
it's not
who
practical.
said that. I don't think it's possible. It's too small.
Yeah.
Like, even the smallest needle I've heard of, I think, is a 0.15.
Jeez, that's like half the size of a 0.3.
Yeah.
Which, to give you a general idea, like a 0.3 might be the size of, like, I don't know, smaller than a toothpick.
Yeah.
Pretty small.
Certainly.
And then that size would be like a pin, like a pin needle, basically. So the notion is that the thinner the needle, the less the amount of paint that comes out. But also with that, you have to use thinner and thinner paint.
Yep.
So the smaller the needle, the thinner the paint, and that means it gets runnier if you break it down too much.
Yep.
So really, I think 0.3 is about the last time I've ever practically been able to use paint, because then the pigment gets too thick for the hole. And you don't think about the atomization of that, but it doesn't really work out. So lots of different ways to do OSL. I would say that airbrushing is certainly the easiest way for the most part. But as you sort of pointed out on smaller models, what you get is you get a lot of bleed. You get spill. You get that sort of, I don't know if bleed's the right word, but you get just, there's a technical term for it where they say it's like overspray. That's the technical term. So if I'm spraying, let's say a guy has, I don't know, a laser sword, like a lightsaber. Maybe the overspray is something I want because I want that spray to hit certain parts of the model where it's going to look like it's a glowing effect or a popping effect. But the problem with the airbrush is that it can overspray and it can get too far. Like let's say he's holding a sword that glows in his right hand and you hit the airbrush on him the wrong way, you may have light coming from an angle that's just not really accurate in terms of how the effect would be applied. So when you use a wet blend or a glaze, then you have more practical control over that. In fact, that'll take us right into tutorial of the week. So we'll move on there. Tutorial of the week is when we talk briefly about any tutorial we have found online that complements the show topic. In this case, we found this wonderful one from Jay Adon called A Look at OSL, and we'll provide a link in the show notes. Are you familiar with Adon's work at all?
I think that's actually one of the first tutorials I've seen of his.
The first time I ever heard about him was on the Independent Characters. They used to talk about Adon all the time. And I didn't know who he was, and I started to look him up. And I follow him on Flickr, and he's really great. He does really top-notch work. And he's a painter that I think he's more quality over quantity. Like if you follow his blog, you'll see that he does fewer figures, but every one of them is amazing. And when you look at his pricing, he very clearly says, I paint to one standard, and it's a high standard. Yeah. So he's the kind of guy you definitely want to go to for like character figures or that sort of thing. Versus white metal where we do more bulk. And I don't know, I think you're kind of a good mix. Like you do really nice detail.
Yeah, I prefer to work on smaller scale and do high level.
Sure.
But
sure. Yeah. So anyway, with A Look at OSL by Jay Adon, he basically shows you he has a female dark elf figure from like a D&D-ish loathing kind of thing. And she's got dark skin and she's holding like a crystal or something in her right hand, and it's got a purple glow. And he basically applies very thin, I would say like wet blends onto her hair and some of her clothing. And he shows you how he builds it up very, very slowly. And he actually uses a few washes too to kind of get the underlying colors. So he'll apply like a thin down purple wash, and he'll kind of settle that onto the areas he wants. He applies it with great control. And he doesn't really let it bleed out on the places he doesn't want. What did you get out of the tutorial?
Yeah, so you'll notice during the video, he actually starts with the darker areas first, and then slowly starts building out the white, which is pretty common. He called it wet blending. I actually thought it was more glazing in my opinion.
Sure.
That's just, I guess, one of those differentiations or whatever. But yeah, he used a lot of thin layers and starts building it up and shows the glow. I like a lot how he showed the purple on the different materials. So he goes over how the purple would reflect on fabric versus the hair, which was beneficial to see and helpful to understand because they definitely do have different properties, or light looks different on different materials. So he covers that nicely, I think.
I think that when you get into that, like that sort of level of detail is what separates, and I would definitely call him a pro painter, that separates him from, let's say, a generic tabletop painter. Even like me, like he really paid attention to how this would reflect versus how that would reflect. Whereas most of the time when I'm doing a big project for a client, I don't have time to sit there and think about that. So I just generally try to get it out. I wouldn't say too quickly, but I don't sit there and go, how would this look on fur versus how would this look on leather? I kind of just go, it's going to be purple, and thin it out. I do think this is sort of a good instance to sort of make a point about how light looks, and one of the properties of light, and I've read this and I'll sort of get your 2 cents on it, is that when light spreads out from an area, you have to think about how the light looks at different distances. So I'll use an example. I'll use lava as a really good example because this is one of those things that I think most people tend to get right. But whenever you see a lava effect, lava tends to glow like this bright red. And then you think about where should the light be darkest, where should it be lightest, how far should the light travel, that sort of thing. So what I generally tend to do is I'll start with my darkest color and work my way in and brighten up as I go. And I've also read that some lights travel farther, like dark light travels this far, light travels this far. Do you ever, when you do OSL, get into that sort of level of detail, or do you just kind of generally give it a, this is what I'm trying to achieve and this is how I'll quickly get there?
Yeah, again, it depends on what level or how.
Sure.
Yeah, if I'm trying to go for a showcase standard or just something basic. Obviously, showcase, you want to show that shadow and get an idea or have a good understanding of how far that light does travel.
Sure.
But if you're just going for something quick, then yeah, you don't. You can't spend that much time figuring out all the shadows and lightings.
And I think this goes back a little bit to client relationships, at least for me. It's sort of a question of how much time do you want to spend on an effect to get your point across. And the only last point I'll make on OSL before we move on is that don't forget the object portion of the object source lighting. Make sure it's an object that would legitimately glow. And this can range, like I think, generally most people would agree like a candle or a lantern is a good idea. But you talked earlier about a focal point on a model. So we're all exposed to miniature and science fiction gaming enough that we can presuppose that certain items might glow, like a sword that's magical, like Sting in the Lord of the Rings movies or whatever. And we realize that glows, when he's around orcs or whatever. So that gives you all sorts of fun ideas. But when it's on a generic model that you don't really have a point of context for, you have to really sort of think about, will this make sense to the viewer?
Yeah.
Will this, like, if this guy is holding a sword, will it make sense that the sword is glowing? Or if he's holding, let's say, something else, will that make sense that that's glowing? So just think about whether or not that object makes sense for it to glow in terms of the viewer.
Definitely.
All right, well, we're going to move on to product review, and this week it is Philip's turn to go. So, Philip, what are we reviewing this week?
All right, so in lieu of, as we're talking about OSL, I figured an airbrushing as a form of technique for that. I wanted to talk about one of the airbrushes that I was using originally. I still use. It's called the Neo for Iwata. The reason I mentioned this one is because it does have that 0.3 needle that Caleb was mentioning earlier.
Can it be upgraded? Because I use a Sotar, but I can actually use bigger needles on that. Can the Neo go bigger?
It does. It actually comes standard with a 0.5.
Nice.
So the 0.3 you'd have to buy separately, but that's what's going to allow you to get at least a good OSL effect on models. You need at least a 0.3 to really get that effectively. 0.5 is too big. But it's also an affordable airbrush.
Yeah.
A lot of the airbrushes nowadays you'll find are like $100 or more. This one I've seen ranges between 70 and 90. So it's a good introductory brush. You have a lot of detail. It's got the functionality that you want in an airbrush for miniature painting.
Sure.
The two things that I've always that are crucial are the type of feed that you get. So there's two types of feed. There's gravity feed, and then there's siphon feed.
Gravity feed is normally the cup on top where the paint flows down, gravity pulls it down.
Exactly.
The siphon feed's the decanter on the bottom that pulls up.
Like a straw, yeah.
I will point out that one of the advantages of a siphon-fed airbrush is that you can load more paint. Like that's, in my opinion, generally the biggest advantage of it. And when I use a spray gun, they're almost always, well, not almost always, but I burn through paint really fast. So having a siphon feed can be useful in terms of you can load up 3 or 4 different bottles early and then just change over color very quickly versus, let's say, a gravity feed where you have to clear the old color, maybe you have to wash, and it just depends on the type of work you're doing.
True, very true.
So for OSL, and you've mentioned this to me before, one of the nice things about, and when we first met you had talked about this with your NEO, it's a cheap enough airbrush that you can get 2 of them. So for blending, you could easily, like, let's say, oh, actually, this was someone else I was talking to, but this still applies. The notion being that if you wanted to use different colors and blend, you could easily, I'm not saying everyone should have 2 airbrushes, but if you wanted to, you could do that and you could blend more readily. Or if you wanted to quickly work in from one color to the next, you could do that too. Like, for example, let's say you're making a blue glow, you're going to need at least a couple colors there. You're going to need a darker blue, a lighter blue, that sort of thing. I think that for some of our listeners, like that will make perfect sense in terms of an airbrush. What about for non-airbrush users? Do you find, is there anything that you recommend for OSL that's not an airbrush?
Yeah, so we were talking about wet blending. I find for wet blending, some of the best brushes I use are actually watercolor brushes. Now I have two from Winsor Newton, Winsor 7 series. They're expensive brushes. You're looking at $15 to $20. Some of them even go way, way high, but those are for their massive ones.
What sizes are these brushes? Are we just talking like standard brush sizes? Just
Yeah, the one that was $20 was a size 1, which would be like a standard brush.
Right.
The 000 was about $14 or $15, and that's a very fine detail.
Sure.
But they hold water very well, and they allow you to blend very easily, and they hold
Are
point
the
well.
bristles different when you say they hold water well? Are the bristles like of a different, like a lot of times with let's say what do they call those things? Some brushes use like a red sable, and it's a type of fur, or like not a fur, but I forget.
It's like a hair. I think
Like
they
a
use a
hair.
coarse hair
Yeah.
sometimes for different things.
People don't realize that, but that's mostly what your brushes are made out of. Is they're made out of some sort of hair,
or they're synthetic.
or they're synthetic.
Those are generally not the ones that you want to use. These, I don't actually know. I think I want to say brown sable maybe. I'm not exactly sure what they use for their.
Sure, but in either case, because they hold more liquid, what does that in terms of like the OSL? Does it just give you more paint to apply, more time to work?
It allows you more time to work. It holds the water in a way that doesn't just gush off the brush.
Sure.
So you're able to control it very easily, and because they're well made, they hold a point. I mean, I've been able to paint eyes with a size 1 brush, and that's a standard brush. I mean, they're big.
Sure.
And you can still get very good detail even with a large brush. So you just have a lot of control, and it's great for any kind of blending techniques that you're trying to do.
If you're ever this is all of our listeners out there, your load is important on a brush. So if you want a brush that can take a good load, and by that I mean like can hold a lot of paint, but don't overload your brush. If you overload your brush, you're going to get a lot of, when you first touch the brush to the model, you're going to get a lot of spillover. You're just going to get a lot of excess paint that not only mars detail, but is going to drip into areas you don't want, and you got to clean it, and it doesn't really work. And
you'll also ruin your brush if you're not careful too, because it'll soak up into the funnel, and then you'll get it inside the brush itself.
Or it'll push the bristles apart slowly, even as it dries. Like the pigment will kind of slowly kind of push them apart, and then you lose your point.
Yeah.
And that's obviously the most important thing when it comes to a brush, what you're looking for. I also use the Sotar, which is similar to an NEO. Not in terms of price, they tend to go for a lot more, but in terms of size and scale. And as you were mentioning earlier, you want a smaller needle. It is important to point out, I think, that a lot of brushes allow you to use a smaller needle, but you have to have different adjustments. Like with mine, when I want to use a smaller needle, I have to change the tip. So I needed a different tip. I needed a different nozzle. And I needed a different needle. So, typically, because I'm replacing parts on my airbrush all the time, mostly because I'm an idiot and I lose them. But if I replace a needle, it's like $15-$20. If I replace a nozzle, it's like $10-$15.
Yeah.
If I replace, the whatever. So I can easily spend $30-$40-$50 to basically go from one needle to the other. And then when you consider the price of an airbrush, like, I don't know, what do you pay for an NEO? Like,
it's like $70 to $90, I think.
Yeah, that's almost half the price of the airbrush.
Yeah.
So I've considered many times just buying extra airbrushes just for parts, almost like a mechanic buying a car to break it down. So what when you do OSL with your airbrush, what PSI do you normally use?
Yeah, so this is another thing I wanted to mention. So you will need a couple other things in order to use this airbrush. You do need to do OSL. You will need a regulator to control the PSI, and generally. I
think most compressors these days come with a regulator, but
some do, but not all. So if you don't, I had to buy mine separate.
Sure.
But the regulator, I'd say usually about 5 to 10 psi when you're trying to do fine detail.
That is a really low PSI.
Yeah, and you'll need 0.3 nozzle. I don't think you can do that on a 0.5.
I've never had much luck with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, not with a 0.5.
You definitely have to have it very thin, as we mentioned earlier. But for those fine details, you need about 5 to 10 psi. You can go maybe as high as 15 to 20 for some of the larger areas.
That's normally about what I rock it. When I find that if I go below 15, the paint has to be so thin,
Mm-hmm.
and I get clogs, and it's just, for me, it's a bigger problem. And that could be that the Sotar just doesn't, the nozzle just doesn't like it below 15 psi. It's just the pigments that I use on the paints I prefer are too thick. And I don't know what paints you use and that sort of stuff, but it could just be for the NEO, it just has a better nozzle or a wider nozzle or whatever. Speaking of airbrushing, GW, and I don't know why we didn't mention this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, they're about to release brand new airbrush paints. So they're finally getting with the time.
Yeah, but
They've had a Citadel spray gun. Did you ever use the Citadel spray gun?
yeah, well, it was like a $15 gun. It was
Right.
only really for basing your army.
Right.
That was a siphon feed, so like as you mentioned earlier, you can crank out a whole bunch of base colors quickly,
Yeah.
which is great.
It's pretty good. The control was really poor.
Was it?
And you had to use a CO2 tank that didn't have an adapter. I adapted mine to my tank. I actually cut off the original line feed and used a different line feed so I could actually use it on a compressor. But the needle was so big that you really couldn't go very thin. So I always had trouble getting the right mix. And it's important to point out, I think, that spray guns and airbrushes are different, and they do make spray guns that are great for basing armies that are not airbrushes, that are bigger. Like the needles are huge. They're 0.8 or whatever. But anyway, this is neither here nor there. What is your thoughts on GW's new airbrush line?
Well, without going too much into a rant on it, I mean, it's exciting that they're doing that, but as everyone, or a lot of people have already kind of pointed out, it's not in a dropper format. So
Right.
you have to either use a dropper tool yourself or buy like an eyedrop tool to remove the paint and put in your pot or whatever.
Why do you think that was? Why do you think that they just didn't go ahead? Do you think it was just a simple we've already got these paint pots?
That would be my guess.
Yeah.
They claim that it wastes less paint. I don't know how.
I don't see how that
doesn't make any sense at all. So
the only reason I could see that making sense is if the paints were not thin to the right amount, and then you had to add them in yourself. But then if that's the case, why wouldn't I just buy the more concentrated form?
Well, I think their claim was that unused paint at the end of your airbrush you can just pour back into the pot easily, which you could technically do with any kind of airbrush to paint. Most of them pop off.
True.
But once you have a decent idea of what you're doing,
Right.
you usually have a good way of guessing. You always want to add. You can always add more paint.
Right.
There's easy ways to counteract that. And now it's just you created a burden for people who want to use an airbrush.
I agree.
So
and I would say that the other side of that coin is whenever I try to pour paint, first off, don't make the mistake that I made my first time of trying to spray it back into the pot. Because I made that mistake only once.
Yeah.
And
Disaster.
Yeah, oh my gosh, that was a nightmare. Because the paint just came out too hard and too fast.
Yeah.
But whenever I do try to pour it back into the paint pot, normally the paint, it's just kind of a pain. Because of the fact that the paint runs out of the decanter or the siphon feed or the gravity feed pretty slowly. So most of the time, what I do is I'll keep a few extra models on my desk, and if I'm priming and I have leftover primer in my airbrush, I'll just be like, well, this needs to get primed too, and I'll go ahead and burn it out.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'll have models that are halfway primed, and then over the course of a week or two, they'll get primed. And this is normally for personal projects, not client projects. But as you said, as you get more proficient with it, you will start to learn how much paint you really need.
And I definitely would recommend, when I was starting off painting, don't be afraid to use more paint than you already have, or that you have. Don't be afraid to waste paint.
In regards to airbrushing?
Airbrushing or any kind of thing you do, just because so many times I would try and be I'm going to be smart, not waste paint, just use a little bit.
Sure.
And you end up, takes more time, you actually end up wasting paint doing that. And you'll learn over time the appropriate amount of paint to use. So let it being a learning lesson as opposed to trying to guess from the get-go how much paint you're going to use. Just put just put enough in there to get the job done. Put a little extra if you think you'll need it, and then gauge it that way.
Good advice. All right, guys, we're going to move on to our 1-minute rant, which is our second to last segment of the show. So last time I kicked it off, I'm going to give Philip the pleasure of kicking it off this time. So, Philip, I think that hopefully this time you're going to... It wouldn't be hard to pass what we did last time.
Right, yeah,
last time
pretty
wasn't really
passive.
a rant, more of a general displeasure. So I know what you're going to rant about, but I'm super curious to see how viewers react to it. So, all right, are you prepared, sir?
Sure.
All right, we're going to put 1 minute on the clock.
So two things really. I'm going to be ranting about, we already just mentioned the eyedropper failure on GW's part, why they didn't put it into a squeeze bottle. Same thing with Forge World, did the exact same problem.
That's true, I forgot about that.
Yeah, they did the same mistake. I don't understand why. So we've already ranted about that enough. The other thing, airbrush haters. People who claim that airbrushing is cheating.
Or easy.
Or too easy.
Yeah.
That it's just wrong. It's not an easy tool to learn. It's very hard to master, and it takes a lot of effort. It's not a cheap way to start either. You've got to invest time and money, and there's a huge learning curve. There's a lot of tutorials you can find on how to use an airbrush online, but I don't understand how you can call it cheating. I mean,
I think their general notion is that a lot of times they'll see big models that rely on big OSL.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know, a guy with a big glowing sword. Like Nagash is a really good example of this.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen some people paint him up, and he's mostly painted with airbrush and OSL. And they think that that's easy. But it's like any tool, it's an application of technique.
Yeah.
I'm just going to carry right on with your airbrush haters, because I also agree that it's like any technique. It's a tool. You learn to use it, and it's not easy, because I've tried to teach people how to airbrush, and I kind of had to learn on my own. And I've gone through 3 or 4 airbrushes that, just got so clogged because I wasn't taking good care of them that they were ruined.
Mm-hmm.
And not knowing the right PSI to apply. And on top of that, if you drop your paintbrush on the floor, you just pick it up and wash it off, and you can just go right on with your day. I lost a nozzle one time. I spent 4 hours tearing my garage apart looking for it, because I couldn't continue with the airbrush unless I had it. Now I buy backup parts for my airbrush. So I'll have an extra nozzle, an extra needle, or extra whatever. But those parts cost $10, $15, $20, $30, $40 a piece in some cases. So the most expensive brush out there is still cheaper comparatively to all of the pieces that make up my airbrush. And if I drop a little nozzle that's the size of like a pen tip, that can completely stop progress.
Oh yeah. And just it's something to think about too for people who are questioning whether or not to get an airbrush or not, as it might be like a tool for cheating type thing. It's, if you actually go back through history and look at artists, you'll actually find that a lot of them use special tools in order to get certain effects.
Sure.
I can't think of the exact terms of things, but some of them would actually grid out a canvas and then paint on a grid. Some of them would use certain tools to be able to, like, they could look through with one eye, and it would help break up the picture and everything, so they could, and then apply it towards the canvas.
Yeah.
And this goes back all the way to 1500s, earlier than before that. So, and these are master painters, people that are revered nowadays. So there is no cheating in art at all. It doesn't matter what.
I would agree, because if the final product looks great, then how you got there, I think. And a lot of times when I see a painting tutorial using an airbrush, what I like to do is I'll kind of start with an airbrush. I'll do my base work with an airbrush. I'll block in my major colors wherever I can with an airbrush. But then that's it. Yeah. Then it comes down to brush work, and like I have to block in the other colors that I can't get to. If I have to do finer details, there's certain things an airbrush can't do. So it's not like I've only painted 1 or 2 figures where they were so big and the detail was so, I don't want to say bland, but big, blocky, that I could use the airbrush for everything. But most of the time, an airbrush is a start. It's like anything else. It's a good way to begin. It's like when you mow your grass with your lawnmower. No one thinks of that as cheating, because then I have to go in with the weed whacker and get the edge.
Yeah, it's efficient.
It's efficient. It's absolutely efficient.
Efficiency is not cheating.
So yeah, airbrush haters, what the hell? Stop hating. Get your own airbrush. Try it out, and let us know how that works out for you. If anyone disagrees with this, I would love to hear from you. And that is it for us. That takes us into our outro. We are out of here this week. We hope you've enjoyed this discussion on object source lighting. Kind of dovetailing into a discussion of airbrushing quite a bit, but that's okay, because that is one of the many, and probably my favorite technique for OSL. So I hope you've gotten something out of it this week. Philip, do you have any sort of final thoughts today?
No, thanks for listening, guys, and stopping by. And hopefully you guys will take some time to actually try this out. Try some airbrush. Please leave comments. Let us know how it worked out for you.
Absolutely.
And if there's anything that we can, of course, do to improve, our podcast.
Absolutely, yeah. This is our newer format. We're excited about the format. We're not only putting this on iTunes, but we're also putting this on it's on the White Metal Games website channel on YouTube, which is YouTube/White Metal Games. And then you can also find this on iTunes if you just look for War Council on iTunes. This is episode 12 on object source lighting. My name is Caleb Dillon with White Metal Games, and War Council is a podcast dedicated to the miniature painting hobby.
And I'm Phil Corman with Brushwork Minis.
And until next time, guys, we hope to have you back, and put your minis where your mouth is.